Hello everybody, I am Tom and you are watching me play Destiny 2. So, they released a pre-twab again. So, they've one day early, they've dropped a bunch of information regarding a bunch of weapon information. So Chris Proctor has put together a kind of collation of information for us. I'm going to go through all of the relevant information on there. I'm not going to actually read it verbatim. If you want to read it yourself, I've got a link to it in the description. I'm sure Astacross has probably done a video, so if you want the audiobook version, I'll put a link to his video too, because he usually just reads all these out, so you can just listen to them rather than having to read them. But, onto the information. First things first, reticle changing color when the weapon is inside effective range. So apparently this is already a thing on console, which I did not know about, but apparently they're making it so that the inside of the reticle will change to a red color when you actually are inside the effective range for your weapon. They're going to make this you'll be able to change the color of it later, but for now it's just going to be red. But you're going to be able to know when your weapon is inside effective range just by looking at your reticle, which is great. I don't know why this wasn't on PC. It's weird they had this on console and not on PC, but it's coming to PC now, so perfect. Next, we have the LFR nerf. So we knew that linear fusions were going to get a nerf. They've been telling us this for a very long time. But the nerf itself isn't as bad as I was expecting. Essentially, it's a 15% damage debuff, so you're doing 15% less damage to anything that isn't a red bar. So champions, mini-bosses, bosses, vehicles. However, the exotics are not included in this nerf, because they wanted the exotics to be more damage than the legendaries, right? So, Sleeper Simulant is gonna be kicking off. Let's just say, shall we? Sleeper's gonna probably be the king of the DPS, if I were to guess. Well, it depends on the other buffs that they're doing here, but I think linears are still going to be really good, Sleeper particularly. But moving on, we have machine gun buffs. So, they're giving a 10% blanket buff to all the base damage of machine guns, which is going to bring them up in PvP. It's actually altering some time to kill values on machine guns in PvP, making them quite a bit better. They're very, very quick with the new TTKs. However, they're also going to be buffing in PvE, just with multipliers on top of that, so it'll be buffing even further. They're also buffing the reserves between 20 and 50%, depending on the machine gun that you're using. So there's a hidden inventory stat. So if you have a low inventory stat, it means you have less reserves. And if you have the low inventory stat, you'll get the big 50% buff. And if you have a high inventory stat, then you'll get less, you'll only get the 20% buff. However, that's still a buff to all machine guns. And it is worth noting here that Avalanche, the one thing that's bad about that is it has shitty reserves. So having Avalanche now is probably going to be really good. I think Avalanche getting that buff is going to be massive. And another one that you may overlook is the fact that Xeno has very low ammo. Heard going around that it's got like a 2 or a 3 on that hidden inventory stat, which means it's getting close to a 50% buff. You're talking like 49.1% thereabouts. That's a big buff to Xeno. Because Xeno's biggest problem is ammo economy, right? So, woo! And of course we have Grand Overture, which the ammo, whatever, that's fine. But the main thing with Grand Overture is a 10% buff to Grand Overture. It already does a shit ton of damage. So a 10% buff on top of that is going to be nice. Moving on now, we have Heavy Grenade Launchers. They are getting a 40% damage buff on red bars, and everything else is getting a 20% damage buff for them. They're also getting more forgiveness with their collision, so it's going to be easier to get a direct hit with a heavy GL. And they're increasing the blast radius across the board on all of them by 1 meter. It's just very good. It's like a big buff to GLs, so technically this could end up being like a GL heavy meta, but we'll see. It is worth noting that Parasite is not affected, because it already does ridiculous damage. A 20% damage buff on Parasite would be stupid. However, they said nothing about Anarchy. So Anarchy is probably going to get a 20% buff. I think there is a lot of GM bosses where Anarchy is going to be the go again. I think Anarchy may have a resurgence because of this buff. Remains to be seen, but I anticipate Anarchy is going to be very good for particular bosses. Okay, next up we have shotguns. They are making the reticle more indicative of what the actual spread angle is. Specifically, if you're jumping or whatever, it will actually spread the reticle out. Currently, it's only working at 85 field of view, and they're aiming to scale that going forward, but currently it's just working on 85 field of view. Ascendant Nomad actually did an interview with Chris Proctor where they talked about this a bit. Essentially, 85 FOV was the default when they were doing D1, so everything was scaled on 85 FOV, right? So the base level was done at 85, which is interesting. It's weird that it hasn't been updated to this point, but seemingly they're working on it now, so great. Kinetic damage buff. So, kinetic weapons, for those unaware, currently do a 5% boost to damage against unshielded combatants. So if you shoot them with a primary gun, it's going to do more damage than if you shoot them with an energy gun. This is being buffed even further. So kinetic primaries will get an additional 5%, pushing them up to a 10% buff on unshielded combatants. And kinetic specials are getting a 10% buff, putting it all the way up to 15% total damage buff on unshielded enemies. Which is kinda nutty. So you're talking like Heritage, Succession, all of those primary special weapons are going to be hitting a lot harder. I think Double Slug might end up being a go here. The Stasis is actually losing the 5% buff because they never really wanted to give it to it in the first place. Stasis has enough extra special stuff it gets, the damage buff isn't really necessary on it. And they're also giving a kinetic damage perk coming sometime in Lightfall, in a similar way to Incandescent and Volt Shot, things like that. They're making one for the kinetic perk, which is interesting. We'll have to see what it is. Next we have some exotic buffs, which I am just going to read verbatim, because it's going to be a lot easier. Give me 1 second. Here we are. So, Queenbreaker, the blinding effect is underwhelming for a heavy weapon, so they've changed how that's deployed. It's also being changed by not being changed by the global linear fusion nerfs because it's an exotic, so that's going to be a buff. But the shot will now chain to enemies using an Arc 3.0 blind, so you get a big blind and it'll do like a big arc thing. Ruinous Effigy feels very voidy, and slamming the Transmutation Sphere was an obvious place to put an additional effect. The Transmutation Sphere Slam, that's a tongue twister, attack will now suppress enemies. That's just great. Ruinous Effigy has always been a really fun gun. Hopefully this brings it up enough that it's going to be actually worth using, we'll see. Leviathan's Breath, getting a really big buff here. It's now going to apply Volatile if you do a perfect draw. It's increased the damage from 396 to 442. The reason this is significant is it allows you to one-hit all supers in the game if you get a critical. And it increases damage versus champions by an additional 30%. So it's now doing Volatile, which gets rid of Overload champions going further, and it has intrinsic anti-barrier. So it's going to be a champion slaughterer come next season. We'll see, but it could be very good. Next we have 1,000 Voices. So they are adding Scorch to the 1,000 Voices. Specifically, they're adding enough Scorch to 1,000 Voices that if you hit every single projectile onto an enemy, you will get an ignition. That's kind of nutty. So each individual kit will do 10, 15 with Ember of Ashes. So it is worth noting that you have to have Ember of Ashes equipped, which is the aspect that gives you additional Scorch stacks. If you've got Ember of Ashes equipped, you will get an ignition immediately when you fire a full burst of 1,000 Voices onto an enemy. This is interesting. This could push 1,000 Voices into being a DPS pick for boss damage, which we haven't seen in a long time. But it definitely could bring it up there, because ignitions are great. Scorch is great. This could be fantastic. Next, we also have Sunshot, also getting subclass verbs, as it were, so it will also get Scorch stacks on the explosion. Same as 1,000 Voices, does the same amount, only you're not hitting multiple times with one shot. So you're getting 10 on base, and then 15 when you have Ember of Ashes equipped. Sunshot might be a really good primary to be using here. 15 Scorch stacks per explosion, which is essentially per shot. Very, very good, and will potentially, if you pair this with a solar subclass, you can be having a lot of explosions going off with this. This is actually what I was hoping for when they started the season, honestly. When they did Solar 3.0 in the first place, I had Sunshot on my Titan ready to go, but it didn't have the Scorch on it, so it was kind of useless. Now, it'll be really good. Next up, we have Polaris Lance. It used to have a burn effect. They've just changed that to Scorch, which makes perfect sense. So, perfect 5th shot now will apply 40 Scorch stacks, 60 Scorch stacks if you have Ember of Ashes equipped, which is a shit ton. So every 5th shot you're going to be doing a bunch of Scorch damage. Ignitions are good, so if you can get them consistently, which Polaris Lance seemingly is going to be able to, this could be huge for boss damage, we'll see. I still don't think it's going to be as good as like 1,000 Voices, but we'll see. Two-Tailed Fox had tough competition as a heavy exotic weapon, but now it's the only weapon that can apply subclass verbs from multiple damage types. So you get Soul Rocket now applies 60 Scorch, 90 Scorch if you have Ember of Ashes. Instead of the burn effect, it will do Scorch, and the Void Rocket now suppresses. And apparently, it says, the Catalyst completes the trifecta? Does it mean that the Catalyst is going to do Arc Jolt, is what I'm getting from this, which seems crazy. And then we have Prometheus Lens. Once again, Solar 3.0 rework. They've added Incandescent as its Catalyst perk, so that's really cool. And Grand Overture's latest buff, increasing the missile damage by 50%, brought it up plenty. It just needs its blind updated to tie into Arc 3.0, so they've switched the Catalyst to use Arc Blind. So specifically Grand Overture, the Catalyst used to blind people, but it technically wasn't an Arc Blind, apparently. So that's now been fixed. Information on hip-fire reticles. By reducing the number of buffs on the left-hand side of the screen, I think is what they're going for here. So they want to put information about certain buffs. Like if you have a weapon that gives a buff, you want the weapon itself to somehow communicate to the player that that's the buff that they're getting. They're testing this on Manticore. So the buff you get for Manticore where you can fly, they're putting that on the actual hip-fire reticle so that you can see it in the reticle without having to have a buff on the side of your screen saying it, right? And then they want to expand this further, but Manticore is like the test case, as it were. And finally, we have some perk changes. Osmosis and Elemental Capacitor are now going to work with Strand. Osmosis obviously works with Strand, it's Osmosis. Elemental Capacitor, however, is giving you a bump to your airborne effectiveness. It gives you 20 airborne effectiveness and 25 for the enhanced perk. Rewind Rounds is now working properly on non-VOG weapons, which is interesting. Apparently, Rewind Rounds, when it was made, only really worked with Vault of Glass weapons, somehow, and they've now fixed that, which means they're going to be putting Rewind Rounds on more weapons outside of just the Vault of Glass raid, which is cool, because Rewind Rounds is a really cool perk. I honestly don't use it all that much, I don't find it that good, but depending on the weapon type, it can be quite good. And Eager Edge. This one I care about a lot, because I love going fast. And they're fixing Eager Edge. There's some kind of nuance to this. They nerfed Eager Edge, right? And the reason they nerfed Eager Edge is because when they released the enhanced version of Eager Edge, it allowed you to do 2 swipes very, very quickly, which they didn't want, right? They wanted it to be 1 and it's done. And they nerfed it, but they didn't nerf it in what I would call an intelligent way. Essentially what they did is they put some limits on how fast you can go, and if you go over a certain speed, it won't let you activate Eager Edge again. A bunch of really annoying things. They've changed it now so it just activates once. If you pull it out, activate it, and then put it away, it's activated, and then it won't activate until the cooldown timer goes down. And then they're getting rid of all the changes they did about momentum transfer and the lunge distance and the airborne lunge penalty and stuff that they put in. All of that is being fixed back and reverted essentially to where it was beforehand. So this is perfect. I love it. Next up, blinding GLs are not actually blinding GLs anymore. They are now disorienting GLs. So the reason they're doing this is because the arc blind effect is now separate from the blind effect you get when you shoot a blinding GL. So they wanted to dissociate the names so it wasn't confusing. This does mean, however, that blinding GLs are not going to be working to stun champions with the blind effect, because it's technically not an arc blind effect anymore. Which is good to have clarification on, because we weren't sure, but now we do know that blinding GLs are no longer technically blinding. That's like a very much an arc subclass thing, is blind. And then we're disorienting with GLs. It's effective, it's the same base effect, but it's different in its implementation. And finally, we have a nerf to Viced Stinger. So, I mean, this nerf makes sense to me, because Viced Stinger is by far the best origin trait you can have, but they're changing it so it will now only reload about 25% of the mag. Probably necessary, but it is sad to see it go, because it was a really cool origin trait. My favorite origin trait. But they're bringing it down, so instead of getting a full reload when it procs, you only get a 25% reload. But yeah, that is everything in this pre-12-12, as it were. I was planning on making a short video, or 15-16 minutes. Anyway, if you like this video, please leave a like. If you aren't subscribed, please consider subscribing. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.